Hi, I'm Simon Drew, and you're listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to find more episodes of the show, as well as articles and information about my one-on-one alignment coaching, then you can head to my website. It's simonjedrew.com. If you do have the means to support the show, then I'd love to see you in my Patreon community. Just go to patreon.com/simonjedrew, where you'll also get access to over 240 episodes recorded before 2020. But for now, enjoy the show. Hey everyone, thank you so much for spending your time here listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast. My name's Simon Drew, and today we have a repeat guest on the show, none other than Professor Joseph Siracusa. And today we're discussing a topic that you might not expect to have found on a philosophy podcast or a Stoic podcast, but nonetheless it's such an important topic to get your head around and to start thinking about, because it has been called the greatest moral issue of human history, and that is the issue of nuclear weapons. And it just so happens that Professor Joseph Siracusa, he is one of the world's leading experts on the history of nuclear weapons. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes to where you can find his book, Nuclear Weapons, a very short introduction. Now, what I love about these conversations, particularly with Joe, is I get to sit back and see how he thinks, look at the questions that he asks, the avenues he goes down to figure out a problem. And I'll warn you before we start, Joseph goes pretty deep into this subject, so strap in, because you're about to get a whole bunch of information that will be useful to you if you're starting to think about nuclear weapons and the effect that they're having or will have on the world that we live in today. So I present to you my conversation with Professor Joseph Siracusa. Okay, so here we are. We've got Joseph Siracusa, Professor Joseph Siracusa, again with us. And Joe, you were kind enough to mention that you wouldn't mind doing an episode with me about obviously nuclear weapons or nuclear. I'm going to say that wrong all the time because I'm Australian. But this is kind of an interesting topic, not one that you'd expect to find on a podcast mostly about Stoicism, but it's a good opportunity to talk about a really complex issue that exists in our world right now and will exist for some time. And it's a good idea for us to kind of delve into these sort of issues and try to think as philosophically as we can about it. But you're going to give me a bit of an intro into nuclear weapons. So I'll let you just jump in and tell us what you know.
Okay, just before I get into my childhood, I just want to say I think that the story of nuclear weapons fits in with the story of philosophy. I mean, the ancient philosophers worried about the end game. That is, when they disappear, what happens? Why civilizations disappear? And I always like to tell Australian audiences that smarter people than we are will ever be have disappeared from the face of the earth. So I'm sure there were people sitting around then figuring, how do we avoid this annihilation? And of course, with nuclear weapons, we now have the power to annihilate ourselves. So we got the same position. We're in the same position that the ancients were about how do we prevent us from disappearing? I mean, that's really what this is all about. I mean, how long do we last? Whether we're Egyptians or Greeks or Romans, whatever it is. I mean, when will this grand civilization end? And it'll end probably with a bang rather than a whisper, which is, in most cases, that's pretty much how it ended, except for diseases and Visigoths and the rest of it. But, I think it has a philosophical implication. The whole debate about nuclear weapons has raised moral issues and about the role of science in society. But now I'm jumping ahead of the story. Now, I was born in 1944 before nuclear weapons. In fact, a whole year before a nuclear weapon was tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico, under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer, America's top scientist there. And this was a weapon that was going to be designed to be used in the war, which we'll get into in a minute. And so I'm about 7 or 8 years old, and I'm in grade school in Chicago. In the early 50s, and every Tuesday in Chicago, there was civil defense drill. That is all the fire departments in the Chicago area, and there are 77 communities in Chicago. This is going on in other cities too. There, the alarms go off, and that we all went under our desks as part of the civil defense drill, and then we came out from under the desk, and we were all shown this cartoon, I think a 9.5-minute cartoon developed by the civil defense people, which is now a classic, by the way. It's in the registry of classics. And it was about Bert the Turtle. And Bert tells us a story. Bert is just a cartoon character with people around him. And Bert tells us that in the event of a flash, this to duck and cover, that is to duck down and cover up your neck, your head, whatever it is. And the presumption is that you would survive to live another day. And the cartoon told us to listen to older people, do what they say, and take cover here, there, in doorways, under doors, and things like that. And at about the age of 7 or 8, I'm also watching on television these hundreds and hundreds of nuclear tests that are taking place in Vegas, or in the New Mexico desert, the Nevada desert. They're taking place in the Bikini Islands. And you can see these enormous blasts. And it's quite clear that ducking under your desk is not going to save you. In fact, Chicago was ground zero by 1952. And by that time, the Soviet Union had the ability to retaliate. They hadn't quite acquired thermonuclear weapons, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is a sort of unlimited multiplier of fission weapons. And so I got very curious between what we were told would help us survive, and I became enormously curious about what Bert the Turtle was telling us. Now, Americans, and I imagine there are other people around the world like this, when they have a very complex narrative, they like to tell a simple story. The more complex it is, the simpler the story has to be to get people to believe it, to utter it, to organize around it, to pray for it, to vote for it, that kind of thing. And the simple story was that if you prepare yourself properly, you can survive a nuclear blast. Now, this is palpably untrue, okay? It's just untrue. And I could see that as a youngster. So as I'm growing up, and I had a normal child in Chicago playing baseball, and after a while, ground zero just kind of went right over my head. You're numb to it. You don't even think about it anymore. And but what we didn't know as kids is that the military-industrial complex, which is a bunch of people, they're not evil people. They're just people who are there. This is the connection between the military people and the industries. They are producing bigger and better bombs, delivery systems. You could develop a great nuclear weapon, but if you can't deliver it, all you got is a bomb in the basement. You can't do anything with it. So we got Raytheon, Boeing, and all General Motors, and everybody developing bigger bombs. And so you sort of ignore that. You've got other things to do in your life. And then by the end of the Cold War, which is Christmas Day 1991, there is sort of a presumption that we don't have to worry about these kinds of things anymore. Moscow-dominated communism has collapsed. The former Soviet Union is gathering up its missiles in Ukraine and Central Asia and other places where they were dispersed. And we don't think about it much, but most people stopped thinking about nuclear weapons. But it was quite clear from what Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin, said, is that the post-Cold War world is now post-nuclear. And so it was always going to be a problem, except that really smart people, particularly university-type people in international relations department, international history, stopped studying nuclear weapons because they thought it was over along with the Soviet Union. But it wasn't. Now, look, let me tell you about that blast on July 16th, 1945. That was the culmination of a massive government-sponsored scientific initiative to beat the Nazis to the bomb. In the late 1930s, 38 or so, word got to America and that's a lot of word. We got the word from a lot of people who were thrown out of or who fled Nazi-dominated Europe and Nazi-dominated physics departments. We got the word that the Germans had actually split the atom, which theoretically, if they can control with a nuclear reactor, they might be able to build a bomb with it. That is to release enormous, untold energy. Now, keep in mind, all the really brilliant people around the world in the 1920s and early 30s are theoretical physicists. These are young men and women, and I'm thinking here of Lisa Meitner, who is one of the women who, a woman who was in on the nuclear fission experiment. These people are working with theoretical physics because they're looking for the source of atomic energy. And of course, what people forget today, that atomic energy is a source of power both for nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors. They're literally in the 20s committing their lives to discovering the energy of the sun. I mean, this is what this is about. These people in the 20s who are in theoretical physics, quantum physics, whatever you want to call it in those days, they're not looking for weapons. They're looking for the source of the sun, energy, endless energy. And they can see that there's a double application here. You can produce endless energy. They used to say it was going to be so plentiful it would be free, but that didn't work out that way. And you could also produce a weapon. Now, it's quite clear that the Nazis are working on this, and a number of American scientists, I'm thinking here of Enrico Fermi, a Jew who left Europe, Leo Szilard, and others who left Hungary, and a number of Germans who left German universities, Niels Bohr, Dane, who left Nazi-occupied Europe. All these people are going to America and they're saying, look, the Nazis are working on this bomb. Now, everyone knows, a child knows that Hitler has no compunction about using anything his military can develop. And so these guys, Leo Szilard and others, and Ed Teller, they're trying to get President Roosevelt's attention in 1939, 1940. They're trying to get his attention to look into this, because technically or theoretically, they have to beat the Germans to this weapon. So a number of scientists go to the home of a fellow in Long Island, and what they did was they went to the home of Albert Einstein, the most famous scientist in the 20th century, and they sit down with him at his desk, and they pull out a piece of paper, and they type a letter to the President of the United States. And it's just, the letter is on the internet. Everybody ought to have a look at it. And Einstein's brilliant. He just puts on it, Franklin Roosevelt, White House, Washington, D.C. Those are the days when the mail got through. Anyway, he says that he has learned, and the physics community has learned, that the German scientists have developed a technique to maybe unleash this nuclear energy through the process of fission, and that we ought to spend some time on this. Now, before you can even get close to harnessing this nuclear energy, you have to build a reactor. And, what's the reactor going to look like? How are you going to cool it down? This becomes very interesting, because the Germans are going to, they reckon that they can use certain kinds of ores to do what they're going to do, or uranium, but they need too much of it to get where they're going. So they think of a nuclear reactor using water, heavy water, which was developed in some godforsaken place in I think Denmark or Norway, and bombed later by the Royal Australian Air Force. I mean the British Air Force with Australian pilots too. Anyway, the Germans look like they have a head start, and it's a very impressive team that they have. They are led by a man named Heisenberg. We all had to read his principle in high school of physics. It's a guy who says that nothing remains the same when you're looking at it. And Heisenberg's got a Nobel laureate for physics, and he's in charge of the department. And he's surrounded by a very enthusiastic cohort of Nazi scientists. And they don't like Jewish scientists. They think that Jewish research is tainted. They just want the Jewish physicists out of their universities. So they pushed them out. And fortunately, all these people wound up in Britain or the United States, which is why we were able to have these great physics departments in the 1940s. Anyway, Heisenberg has got this remit from the Third Reich to develop a nuclear weapon. Now, what he has is he's got this authority, but it has to be done within a War Department within the Wehrmacht. He doesn't get all the money in the world, and he tends to go down the wrong track. He thinks he can control this thing, maybe with graphite, and he's using impure graphite. If he used pure graphite, he might have been able to control or get a nuclear, get the transformation from there to the actual ore itself. But he didn't do that. So they're going down a little different road. And they have finite resources. You know, Hitler, he's interested in tanks and planes and V-2 rockets. He's interested in a fix. You know, he wants to win this war as quickly as possible. Well, Einstein sends this letter off to President Roosevelt. And he says in the letter, I don't know if this thing can actually be built. But if it can, it might even be too big to be put on an airplane. Could put it on a boat or a ship, bring it into a harbor and blow up the harbor. Well, that would be disastrous too. He didn't imagine that you couldn't actually build something, put it on an airplane, and then drop it. You know, that was, you know, and all the calculations, by the way, are based on Einstein's own calculations. E equals mc squared. This is the formula that tells you that if you break up these atoms, they're going to produce a little more energy than places for them to go, and then more energy after that. So off you go. And so even Einstein didn't know whether it could be built. There are a lot of things we know we can do, but we just, you know, we know we can go to Mars, but getting there is very hard. You know, if you and I want to go to Mars tomorrow and we go in front of the State Library in Victoria and Melbourne and say, let's go to Mars tomorrow, we'll probably be locked up under the medical act as lunatics. But, you know, when a government looks at something, they take it seriously. Now, I think Roosevelt was prepared to spend almost nothing at the beginning. And then a couple of weeks later, he's going to set up a committee to look at uranium and this bomb project. And he's going to use some results. He's going to tie up with the Brits who are working on tube alloy. They're working on the same thing, but they don't have nearly the resources to do it. And so in 1940, President Roosevelt starts a program. It's called the Manhattan Project. That's because it begins in a warehouse in Manhattan. It's just a name on a folder. And the Manhattan Project is going to have about 60,000 men and women in different parts of the United States working on different components for this bomb, different places, different universities and labs and stuff like that. In Chicago, they're working with Enrico Fermi. In New Mexico, they're working with Robert Oppenheimer, and he's brought his team with him. And a lot of the Brits are working with him. And there are great scientists from all over the free world, or what's left of the free world, working on this project. Now, the Manhattan Project has something that the German project does not have. And what it has is a blank check. The Roosevelt government has given the Manhattan Project a blank check to develop this weapon if they can. Now, they don't know when they're going to develop the weapon, but it's always going to be used against the Germans, or it's always to beat the Germans to the bomb. This is the idea. That's the whole thing here. It's driven by fear, and they got a blank check. And now Roosevelt really does it. He trusts the scientists to do the job if they can do the job, but he doesn't trust them with the money. So he puts in charge of the scientists, he puts another guy, a guy named General Groves, who was famous for building the Pentagon. He's kind of like an architect type general. And so he's in charge of the whole project, though he gives free rein to Robert Oppenheimer. And of course, there are a lot of the scientists, and a lot of their wives are former members of the Communist Party in the 1930s, people highly idealistic in the anti-fascist movements around the world. So some of them look a little dodgy. And so General Groves is very worried that maybe the Soviets would be spying. Now, while this project is developing, and central headquarters is Los Alamos, New Mexico, the Soviets have spies everywhere. British spies, Canadian spies, American spies. There are all kinds of people who are handing the Soviets whatever information they can on this project. At the same time, the project is highly secret in the United States. American citizens don't know what's going on. Various people in the Manhattan Project don't know what's going on. You've got chemists and physicists, and they're all working in compartmentalization. It's not like they're building the perfect automobile tire. I mean, they try something, it doesn't work, they start all over again. Yeah, it's a race to beat the Germans to the bomb. Now, on the night of, I think it's May 7th and May 8th, the Nazis are knocked out of the war, and they haven't got this bomb. In fact, they failed. They just failed. And at about this time, the Soviets and the Americans and the British trying to scoop up as many of these scientists as possible to find out what the Germans knew. This is very important. Now, the Brits get a bunch of scientists, including Heisenberg, and they take them to a farm called Farm Hill in England, and they secretly tape record them to find out what they knew, at the same time keeping them in complete ignorance around them. And, they didn't believe the Americans or the project had got off the ground. They didn't even think it could be done. And, after the war, Heisenberg, to rehabilitate himself, wrote in his memoirs that he could have gotten the bomb anytime he wanted, but he didn't want to give it to Hitler. That was his way of trying to ease his way back into German society, or West German society after the war. So this bomb is tested on July 16, 1945. There are two bombs. So one's plutonium, one's uranium. I think it's the plutonium bomb that's tested on July 16th, and it just, the desert turns into green glass, and you can see it miles away, and things shook. And Oppenheimer, who's a very learned man, he's one of these guys who had a lot of time and money on his hand when he was a kid, and he'd read classics in German and French just to keep his mind sharp. He sees this blast, and he says, he quotes Sanskrit literature, poetry. He says, I am death. Wow, I am death. I'm the purveyor of death. And the guy next to him is this Irish guy who's the engineer and in charge of all the stands or the equipment on the day. And he says to Oppenheimer, who's quoting Sanskrit literature or poetry, he says, gee, Opie, now we're all sons of bitches. Well, on that day, July 16, 1945, they had two bombs. They had a plutonium bomb, which was tested, and they had a uranium bomb, which wasn't tested. And the bombs were of very good quality, and they weren't considered to be immoral, by the way. This was just a further development of the British Grand Slam and other huge bombs. I mean, by the time these people think about using a bomb, over 26 German cities have been destroyed by aerial bombardment. That was the cities were getting bombed, the morale was being destroyed, and all that kind of thing. So that was just that wasn't a question. That wasn't a question. The question is, who were they going to use this bomb against? Now, some of the scientists jack up and they say, well, this bomb was designed to beat the Germans to the punch. Here it is, July. The Germans were defeated in May 1945. Maybe we should just back off. And of course, as they say in science, you never know if it works until it works. The scientists call it, with all due respect, the Jesus principle. You don't know whether it works until it comes. And so there is an automatic assumption that the bomb is going to be used on the next enemy. And the next enemy is Japan. Now, in April, May 1945, the Japanese look like they're pretty much defeated. The Americans control the skies over Japan. In fact, General Arnold and others are bombing whatever they want, but they're leaving some cities open for something. No one knows why. But in April, there's an incendiary raid using gasoline in the bombs over Tokyo, and Tokyo's wiped out. tens of thousands of people die, or they're terribly burnt and all the rest of it. The Americans own the sky, but at the same time, in April, May, the Japanese do something that no one expected. To show their resolve, they introduced over 3,000 kamikaze pilots into the Pacific Ocean to attack American battleships and cruisers and aircraft carriers and the like. And you got these young men trapped in their Zeros or whatever they are, and they're making incredible. They have incredible success. They're sinking ships, they're killing thousands of people, and what they're showing is that the warrior class in Japan and the class of the Bushido are going to fight till the death. And there are millions of soldiers left in Japan and in Manchuria and other places. And the Japanese don't have to worry about their flank. Now, they've had, throughout the entire war, a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. And so didn't have to worry about a two-front war. They're only worried about the Americans, to a certain extent, the Brits. And so the Japanese are showing the ability to fight to the end. And no one wants to go door to door on Japanese soil. Urban warfare is just bad news. I don't care what war it is. If you got to go door to door, you're in there for the long haul. So this weapon is sitting there, and the assumption in Washington is, well, it'll just be used on the next enemy. Now, that assumption is made by a new president. Franklin Roosevelt doesn't live to see the bomb. He dies on April 2nd, 1945. He's replaced by a senator from Missouri, Harry S. Truman, who's a little less urbane than he is. He was in charge of, making sure there weren't too many awards going on in contracts, and he's a pretty knowledgeable guy. But no one told him about the bomb. The bomb was so secret in Washington that the secretary in charge, Secretary of War, didn't tell this guy. Didn't tell the vice president about the bomb. Truman only hears about it after Roosevelt's dead. And this guy's name, the secretary, is Secretary Stimson. Now, in those days, there was no Department of Defense, Simon. There was a Department of War. And Henry Stimson was the Secretary of War. And the president, or the new president, is on his way to Potsdam to meet with Stalin and Churchill about what to do with Germany. In those days, there's a lot of personal symmetry going on. They want to get a feel for each other. So on the ship over, on the ride over, Stimson hears that the July 16th bomb was successful. I think the code word was patient well, better than expected. And so the word is given to Truman at Potsdam, which is a suburb outside of Berlin, that the bomb works. And so in July 1945, Truman issues a proclamation to the Japanese to surrender unconditionally or else. Now, these guys are not into the or else business. They'll after 3,000, 4,000 kamikazes, they're not or else. They're going to fight to the death. Mm. And so he offers them, and they reject it. Now, in those days, the military is pretty much running the show. Got the emperor in the background, who's probably as complicit as hell, but he doesn't have the final say yet. And so he's offered them unconditional surrender, or he says utter destruction. Well, what does that mean? Well, what could be more utter destruction than incendiary bombs over Tokyo, which destroyed the city? I mean, the Japanese had already seen what it looks like. So they sort of know what's coming, but they're going to fight. This is an ancient civilization which is going to fight to the last man and woman rather than give up their culture. And because they regard unconditional surrender as the surrender of everything they value. Now, unconditional surrender meant the surrender of the various isms or doctrines that power these people. It doesn't mean the utter surrender of everybody. So the Japanese reject the offer. So Truman gives the order to use the bomb. Now, there are 2 bombs ready, and they are carted over to a little island off of Japan and Tinian, and they are placed on 2 planes ultimately. The first one is Enola Gay, and this is I think the captain there is a guy named Tibbet, who named the plane after his mother. And I've seen accounts, recent accounts, where some scientist said that the damn bomb almost blew up on the plane because they're playing with it. They're trying to wire it at the last minute. Now, this bomb that's assembled, this atomic bomb, has the equivalent of 14,000 tons of TNT. So we call these kilotons, 14,000 tons of TNT. And it's dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 at 8:15 in the morning. Now, the Americans own the sky. The plane goes over Hiroshima and it comes back for its pass. And a lot of people think that the plane's dropping propaganda, because in those days, planes were dropping propaganda. And so the people in Hiroshima are given the all clear. Now, Hiroshima is technically a military target. There's military troops there. There's military production there. There are also prisoners of war there who finally got out. But, and so the bomb was dropped at 8:15. And the world's never seen anything like this. Now, it has seen. This war killed 60 million people. This war just doesn't fool around. I mean, millions of people are dying. And I don't care whether you get hit with an atomic bomb or you're hit over the back of the head with a rifle butt. Dead is dead. And so lots of people are dying. So Truman reckons that if the bomb works, it might shorten the war, because they've already calculated the invasion of Japan in September 1945, Olympia. It's going to be a couple stages. And, Australians are going to be involved, Brits and others. And there's going to have to be just a land invasion of Japan. So Truman reckons that if this stuff works, and they don't know how revolutionary it is until it actually detonates, that it might shorten the war, save a lot of lives, including Japanese lives. So on August 6th, 1945, the bomb is dropped. Hiroshima is decimated or destroyed, and we got about 40,000 people dead, all kinds of people having radiation sickness. No one really knows what this is. It was estimated that the radiation would dissipate within 20, 30 minutes after the blast, but they got that part wrong. And so the Japanese are looking at this and trying to figure out what's this all about. Now, a number of American scientists and international scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project are very angry. They argue that the Japanese should have been served up a demonstration of the bomb to have a chance to surrender. A number of people who worked on the bomb to beat the Germans to it are a little less enthusiastic about using it against the Japanese, because to them, the Japanese look like they're defeated, but they're not really defeated. In wartime, Simon, you don't defeat anybody until you put both feet on the ground. Unless there are boots on the ground, you haven't beaten anybody. You can bomb them till kingdom comes. Still got to put the boots on the ground. Anyway, these are people who have raised a number of concerns, and they're starting to have second doubts about this atomic bomb. Now, the Japanese don't want to do anything about it. Now, we do know, and in my little book, Nuclear Weapons, I've just done a third edition for Oxford. We do know now that the Japanese were working on an atomic bomb too. We found some nuclear reactors there after World War II. They were working on it. Everybody in the science community knew that. Everybody was working on something to harness the energy of atomic energy. So the scientists probably knew. The military people are in denial. They don't want to accept this. They would rather fight to the last person. Now, there's a peace party in Japan. These are pretty tough people. When I say peace, I don't mean they're peaceful. I mean, these are people who figure, well, let's we are defeated. Let's try to stop killing people. Let's get out of this thing. Let's at least submit to force majeure. That is, the forces beyond which we have no control. And the second bomb is dropped on Nagasaki 2 days later. And fewer people die. I think it's about 40 instead of 50,000, whatever. These are huge numbers. We don't know. People just vanished. And this particular bomb was 22,000 tons of TNT. Now, I only mention the tonnage because These are puny bombs by today's standards. These are two primitive nuclear weapons measured in thousands of tons of TNT. By 1952-53, when thermonuclear weapons are finally developed, we're measuring now bombs in millions of tons of TNT, megatons. We're talking about the order of 1,000 over these things. But these things are pretty destructive. Well, at the end of the second bomb, the Japanese military are still very determined to fight to the end. But there is a group there who get the emperor to intercede and sort of cast the vote. And the emperor goes on radio. It's the first time the public's ever heard his voice. In fact, he's speaking in a Japanese that they've never heard, as a matter of fact. And this Japanese emperor is probably as complicit as everybody else. He was complicit in the invasion of China in the 1930s and all the rest of it. And the State Department was going to get their hands on him and hang him after the war. And as it turns out, the Americans decided to use him to sort of defuse the situation. Anyway, the emperor goes on radio and says, he tells everybody to surrender. Now, the Japanese are able to tell themselves that they weren't defeated by this superior white race of people coming out of America. They were defeated by science. See, that's palatable. We were defeated not by people who are superior to us, but we're defeated by modern science. So, they can end that way. And when I think General MacArthur went in there to take the surrender, it was only with a handful of troops. In fact, Churchill said, never has a country surrendered with so few foreign troops on the soil. So on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, which is, by the way, permanently based at Pearl Harbor, General MacArthur, with an open shirt, and the Japanese have got their morning suits on. They look very snappy there, and they're going to surrender. They're going to sign the surrender document. And, for all we know, there could have been another kamikaze coming out of the sky. They just assumed that most people were going to surrender. So on September 2nd, 1945, the Second World War technically ends. The atomic age has begun. And some scientists, including physicists in London, a guy named Blackett, argues that the atomic bomb was the last act of the Second World War and the first act of the Cold War, that it was used as blackmail, or it was used not to defeat the Japanese, who were already defeated, but it was used to telegraph the Soviet Union that if they don't behave themselves in Eastern and Central Europe, the Americans have the atomic bomb. And the presumption there is you're going to use a weapon like this against your ally for 4 years. I mean, it's sort of preposterous, but the argument is it's used to intimidate the Soviet Union because the Red Army has hundreds and hundreds of crack divisions, whereas in the West is going to try to demobilize as quickly as possible. Now, there are a number of arguments have risen since then. Did the bomb end the war? Well, some people think so. Some people think that the bomb was used to blackmail the Soviets into cooperating. And there's this phrase, atomic diplomacy, that was popularized when I was in graduate school in the 60s. And it was, the argument was that Truman delayed the meeting in Potsdam until the bomb was successfully tested. Well, that's a great story, but it doesn't really hold together. Because the guys making the bomb, the men and women making the bomb, they didn't know when the Japanese were going to surrender. They didn't even know that anybody would be in the war at that time. Their job was to beat the Germans to the bomb. And then in recent years, the scholarship has suggested that the Japanese surrendered when they found out there was no one to surrender to. That is, there was no one they can go to effect a surrender document. That is, it was going to go to a neutral power and maybe organize some kind of surrender. Now, Stalin had promised that he would enter the war against Japan 2 or 3 months after the war in Europe was over, okay? And about an hour after that first bomb, the Soviet Union broke its neutrality treaty with the Japanese, and they invaded Manchuria. And they killed 5 days, 5 days, 80,000 Japanese soldiers, and wounded another 250,000. So some people to this day in Japan argue that Japan was defeated not by the atomic bomb, but by the entry of the Soviet Union into the war. And I'm very proud to say that my little book on nuclear weapons, which disagrees with that argument, is now being adopted in Japanese schools. Oxford sold the Japanese rights last year, so it's coming out. And so mine is kind of the first different story they're telling. You know, it's very important. If a country has been involved in terrible crimes, I mean, the Japanese were very bad actors in the Second World War, particularly with the Chinese, senseless murders and rapes, killings, and all the rest of it. And they acted barbarously by Western standards. And so when the bomb is dropped, it gives them a chance to play the victims. So yes, we were terrible. Look what you've done to us. Now, at no time has the United States ever apologized to Japan for that bomb. It was not seen as a terrorist act at the time. It wasn't seen as an atrocity at the time. It was just seen as another weapon. That's why no one's ever apologized for the atomic bomb. You know, no one's ever going to apologize for the atomic bomb. So by 1945, we had probably 7 or 9 American bombs in the arsenal. Now, the Soviets know pretty well what's going on. They're grabbing their own scientists. They're working on the project themselves. And they don't really see themselves in a hurry to develop a nuclear weapon because they've got hundreds of first-class divisions, which have just destroyed the best army in the world, the Wehrmacht. So, you know, Stalin's able to ignore that a little bit. By the same token, if someone has an atomic bomb and they're wearing it on their hip, you know that in every negotiation you go into them, every time they got a disagreement, they could reach for it or threaten to reach for it. That's really what Stalin was worried about, whether they would threaten to reach for it. So anyway, that's the first part of the story. We got about 7 to 9 bombs in 1945. We've got the Western forces are demobilizing. The Second World War is over. The Americans and others will be occupying Japan, but not the Russians. The Russians are not invited into the occupation of Japan. The Russians will take back some islands that the Japanese took from them in 1904. And there are a number of other grievances that they have that no one's going to stop. And so we've got a nuclear age. Now, scientists and politicians can see in September 1945, there's something new on the stage. There's something new on the landscape, and that's atomic weapons, which also can lend itself to atomic energy research. So there's that whole conflicting thing about whether we develop more weapons or we develop nuclear energy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Robert Oppenheimer, who is the father of the atomic bomb, becomes the man of the year on Time magazine. He's on television and radio. He is the moral voice of the atomic bomb. You know, he's arguing that we had to use it, but we really shouldn't go any further. Now, everybody knows that there is a development after atomic fission. That's a thermonuclear weapon, which is based on atomic fusion. Now, Ed Teller, who didn't like, he was the Hungarian Jewish guy, he didn't like Oppenheimer at all. And we could have developed thermonuclear weapons in 1945. You don't need one to get to the other. But that research was set aside as too theoretical. And so that's thought about in the background. We should be working on something else. But no one really working on anything else because between 1945 and 1949, the United States enjoys a monopoly of atomic weapons. It has an atomic monopoly. And then everything changes. I mean, the Cold War is starting to rage too, and the Soviet Union has Sovietized Eastern and Central Europe. The democratic lights have gone out in Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria, and Romania, and East Germany, and all the rest of it. You know, they're just moving in. And so we have the Berlin crisis of June 1948. We got the lights going out in Czechoslovakia when the foreign minister is thrown out a window. And so the Soviets are looking very difficult. They're looking like they're throwing their weight around. And Truman has told the Soviet Union, look, this is not a one-way street. You've got to behave yourself. But they don't think he's going to use an atomic weapon. And because there's no need to, if if you've got the only atomic weapon in the room, you don't really have to use it because the other guy knows you're going to use it if you push them. So it's now August 29th, 1949, and we have learned for the first time the Soviet Union has acquired a nuclear weapon. And the American president announces it. The British Prime Minister announces it. The word gets out to the public that the Americans have detected a nuclear detonation on Soviet soil. I think a plane is flying. One of these sensor planes is flying by, and it picks up some radioactivity material. But you know what? They don't know what kind of bomb they've created. Could the Russians, who have first-class scientists, by the way, and a first-class discipline, that is the secret place with a gun behind you, you don't get to make too many mistakes in Soviet science. Is it possible that the Soviets have jumped from nuclear fission, and whose weapons are measured in thousands of tons of TNT? Maybe they have jumped to a thermonuclear weapon. Maybe they've jumped to the ultimate weapon, measured in millions of tons of TNT, in which case they've taken a qualitative step over American industrial superiority. And of course, this is the great thing here. And, 1949 is a terrible year for the free world. We got the Chinese Revolution is successful. Mao drives into Beijing on an American tank, of all things. The Chinese government flees to Taiwan. So we got the atomic bomb in August. We got the end of Czechoslovakia in Eastern Europe, and we got the Chinese Communist Party is successful in China. So this is kind of a bad year for Washington. And now they find out that the Soviets have acquired a nuclear weapon. Now, what to do about it? Now, in January 1950, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, they go see Truman, and they say to him, look, the Soviet Union has probably developed an atomic fission bomb and possibly developed a thermonuclear weapon, and within 5 years will have the capability of delivering it to the United States. In those days, one-way sorties over the North Pole would have got major cities in America destroyed. And so they reckon now they're on the clock. They got 5 years before the Soviet Union can multiply these bombs and produce more of them. And what kind do they have? Maybe they have a bomb that dwarfs over American weaponry. So they're in this office, and it's extraordinary. It's about a 10-minute conversation, maybe 15 minutes. So they tell the president, the Soviets probably have this bomb, possibly might have a thermonuclear weapon, which they call the super, though no one knew what it looked like, what you had to do to build it, or how you get it to a bomb site. It's all theoretical. It's on paper. And so the president says, well, if they can do it, or if they can try, then we better have one of these things too. So what President Truman did on that January day, 1950, is he gave the science community, now we're getting the beginning of the military-industrial complex, he's done something amazing. He's given them their second blank check in a lifetime. 1940, they get a blank check, which comes out to about $2 billion. And now they get another blank check. And the president says, if you can develop a thermonuclear weapon, do so. And they do this within 2 years. In the first island they tested it on, Simon, the island disappeared, including all the test results. I think it was called Big Mike or something. It just bloody disappeared. This thermonuclear weapon. And there were thousands, hundreds of tests done with it. And I've recorded these in my book, Nuclear Testing, 1945 to 1963. There were over 1,054 nuclear tests. Many of these were thermonuclear. And you can dial up the damage, and you can dial it down. And sometimes these things produce massive explosions, not always on American soil, often on in the bikinis and Southwest or in the Pacific. And so we're going to get this thermonuclear weapon. Now, Robert Oppenheimer has argued that the thermonuclear weapon is immoral because it does not distinguish between combatant and non-combatant. It no longer makes any sense. And Ed Teller steps in and questions Oppenheimer's patriotism. In fact, he even suggests that he's got spies in the family. Well, he did. He had communists in the family, and a brother who was rotten, and a wife who had been a member of the party. And so, they're able to pull his security clearance, which is the end of your days as a top scientist. So he went off to Princeton for the rest of his life to spend, had lunches with Albert Einstein, who was at the Institute of Advanced Study there. So they're all hanging around together. But the bomb now is in the charge of Ed Teller. And Ed Teller is this kind of, he's the guy, by the way, in Learning to Love the Bomb, in the movie and in the book, kind of the mad scientist. And Teller's famous line is, and I love it, he says he's never met a bomb he didn't like, because he's interested in blowing things up. And he's got his handle on his thermonuclear weapon. And so the United States enjoys superiority in nuclear weapons between 45 and 49. From 49 to at least 1969, it enjoys nuclear superiority. That is, not only does it have nuclear weapons, but it has delivery systems. It's going to have missiles, submarines. It could even deliver nuclear weapons with artillery and stuff like that. And so it enjoys this superiority. And the Soviet Union and the United States then go into race. Interestingly, shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which was all about nuclear weapons, it was mainly about Nikita Khrushchev looking for a cheap way to threaten to change the balance of power. That is, he wanted to bring in intermediate range missiles in Cuba to threaten the United States. These missiles take about, a couple hours to get where they're going, but if they're in Cuba, it's 90 miles away, so you don't have much time to think. And so he's going to try to alter the balance. Also, he was going to try to force the Americans out of Berlin, because Berlin is a divided city deep in the Soviet zone, and it's hemorrhaging East Germans who are trying to escape to the West. So Khrushchev's looking for a shortcut here, and backfires. And shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Americans and the Soviet Union, after much atmospheric testing and all these stories about radiation, it's killing people, it's killing fish, and everybody can see that radiation is the thing to worry about. I think one of the first movies I remember in the atomic age was going to the downtown Chicago theater and seeing a movie called Them, which is these giant ants that grow up near nuclear explosions. I mean, it scared the hell out of us. But there was a lot of this theory about the damage of radiation. It's interesting. In 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union are able to sign a limited test ban treaty, not to test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere or in outer space or on planets, things are on the moon even, that kind of stuff. So it's about banning nuclear testing in the atmosphere, not underground, but in the atmosphere. Now, I know the man who negotiated that, Governor Abel Harriman, who ran for president a couple of times, and he had the president's authorities to do whatever he wanted. He's an excellent diplomat. And the only reason he said to me that they agreed to sign this treaty after the Cuban Missile Crisis was because both the Soviet Union and the United States had already mastered three-stage rockets. They knew how to put an ICBM up in the air. They knew how to do all that. Both sides agreed that there was nothing more to be gained from atmospheric testing, because the fallout was coming down on top of people and turning half the world anti-nuclear. They're not in the United States. It happened mainly in Europe, particularly in Britain. So they agree on limited test ban. That's no more testing in the atmosphere, because they have mastered the three-stage rocket. I mean, America's real wake-up call was, I think, 1957, when the Soviets put a rocket into orbit. We all woke up one morning as kids, and the Soviet Union has taken a quantum leap over America, because if you could put a rocket into orbit, you could also drop it on your head. So there was this fear that the Soviets had taken this leap forward. There's always this fear. Nuclear weapons are driven by fear of the Soviet Union, fear of the Japanese war, and it's fear of the arms race, And all the problems of the Cold War began as political and ideological. By the 1960s, the Cold War with the Soviet Union was about the nuclear arms race. By now people had learned how to live with communism in the communist bloc, and no one was going to go to war over an idea in the West, but or they were going to go to war over nuclear arms race. So I got this period where the Americans are developing all this submarine-launched ballistic missiles, airborne ballistic missiles, and ICBMs. And then people say, what's America doing with a triad? Because they want to deliver it three ways. And that's because each of the armed forces wants a piece of the action. Everybody wants to deliver the nuclear weapon. And by the way, before I forget, I also got to know and interview the man who did the strategic bombing survey after World War II, and this was Paul Nitze. He was the co-author of that bombing survey. And I said to Nitze, I said to him, why two bombs? I mean, if the first bomb makes sense and it's justifiable, why the second bomb if they were going to surrender? If you could have got them to surrender in the first bomb. And he said, well, in war, you got to put two bullets in the back of the head of the guy you're killing. It's the second shot, the coup de grace. It's the shot. It's the second shot. They didn't use two bombs just for the hell of it. They used two bombs because they figured it takes two of anything. And today you see it today when terrorists attack, they attack in two places. They're always attacks are in two ways. And so it was the classic war strategy. Now in the thermonuclear age, by the late 1960s, it was seen that there are no advantages anymore in nuclear weapons. So both sides agree to mutual assured destruction. This is MAD, mutual assured destruction. That is, by the time you get to Nixon, he's agreeing that, you can put caps on offensive weapons, that in terms of defending against them, it should be very limited because our cities, our countries are open to mutual destruction. And if there's mutual destruction, no one's going to fire the first shot. So that's the story. Now we get to Able Archer, the exercise in 1983, where some Soviet technicians, they see American nuclear missile coming over the horizon next to a NATO exercise in Europe. And one guy has to make a decision whether this is a real attack or not. And he argued that if it was an attack, it wouldn't be just one missile, it would be hundreds of missiles. Now keep in mind that during the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States together produced over 128,000 nuclear weapons. These are strategic weapons. These are thermonuclear weapons, okay? These don't include tactical nuclear weapons. No one's ever counted those. No one counts them. Those are the kinds that Putin has on a shelf today. And Americans have them buried somewhere at some base. Everybody's got tactical nuclear, but they're talking about major weapons, strategic weapons. And 98% of the nuclear weapons created since 1945 were created by the Soviet Union and now Russia and the United States. And today, 2020, those 128,000 strategic nuclear weapons are now down to about 18,000. That's our best estimate. And the nuclear club is now gone from 2 to 9. Britain was shut out of American research quite rudely, I might add. They were part of the whole deal. They contributed mightily to it. And with the secrecy around the atomic bomb, Americans started to imagine through the McMahon Act that these are secrets. And the only reason the Soviet Union could ever acquire a bomb is that they stole it. And just so happens that between 1945 and 1949 was the golden age of Soviet espionage. The Soviets were everywhere. They had spies everywhere. These guys gave them so much information that they used to pile up outside the post office box at their consulates in New York and Chicago. They had all the information they wanted. Did they actually make a bomb based on information? Khrushchev says in his memoirs, not really. But there are plenty of spies around. So we're moving to these doctrines. Now, under Kennedy, we had this sort of flexible response. I'm going to back up a little bit. Under Eisenhower, followed Truman, we had this threat to use nuclear weapons at time and place of our choosing, said the president. So he reserved the right to use a nuclear weapon. And he was talking here to the Chinese and the Russian support for the Chinese in Korea. They weren't going to see American lives go on for loss of lives forever without threatening a nuclear weapon. So they're threatening a nuclear retaliatory strike unless the Korean thing can settle down. And it did settle down shortly after that. And then when they both had nuclear weapons, the Kennedy people, led by Robert McNamara, talked about a flexible response. That is, we'd raise the scale of the nuclear ladder, that we'd scale the ladder of violence to a certain extent that we didn't have to use everything at once, Instead of just an all-out nuclear war, maybe we can use tactical nuclear weapons. Now, the argument from the 60s onwards, can you have a limited nuclear war? My argument from the 60s onwards, that's impossible. Now, keep in mind that the people in the United States who are writing about nuclear weapons are scientists, they are economists, they are mathematicians, there's a RAND Corporation, there are all these people working on rational theory and stuff like that. And, I argued in my books that there are only two things you can do with a bomb. You can use it or not use it. It's not very clever what you can do with it. And if you don't use it, you can threaten people with it, which is why everybody wanted a nuclear weapon, because as soon as you get a nuclear weapon, Simon, you get to eat at the head table. People treat you differently. You get the best table in the restaurant. So today we have 9 nuclear powers. The Israelis have never owned up to theirs, but the Arab world knows they have nuclear weapons and they would use them as a last resort. Britain wanted one because the Americans shut them out to represent their sovereignty, and they got one and tested it at all places in Australia. And then if the British had one, then the French had to have one, de Gaulle had to have one. So we got de Gaulle, and then China got one in the early 60s. And now they're worried about the nth country, that is how many countries were going to have nuclear weapons. And it's at that time, in the late 60s, that the idea of having a nuclear non-proliferation regime was thought of. That is, that's the NPT treaty, where the nuclear powers turn over their nuclear research, that is the energy part of it, isotopes, medical isotopes, etc., to the part of the world that disavows interest owning nuclear weapons. This is the grand bargain. The nuclear powers will hand over the peaceful application of nuclear energy to the other nations which disavow owning them or acquiring them. Well, that's the grand bargain. And of course, the other part of the bargain is that the nuclear powers would get rid of their weapons over a period of time. Well, that did not happen. So the NPT is probably the cornerstone. Now, there are a number of agreements made during the Cold War about the number of weapons and certain kinds of weapons. The INF Treaty in the late 80s about banning short-range nuclear missiles because, when a missile could have a nuclear weapon on it or dynamite, no one knows, so people just assume it's nuclear. So there's all these kinds of agreements. And I mention these agreements because by the time we get to the world today, most of these agreements, they're off the table. They, Trump and Putin and others, they've disavowed the agreements. So in the year 2020, with all these nuclear weapons around and delivery systems, and the modernization of nuclear weapons, that is, making them smaller and more effective, somebody might reckon that using a nuclear weapon on a cruise missile, which we used to have, might be a good idea of stopping a Soviet or Chinese aircraft carrier, or to prevent them from shooting down or sinking American aircraft carrier. So if we use smaller weapons, nuclear weapons, this would be a warning. Now, I go back to this. Can you have a limited controlled nuclear war? And my argument is no. Once you launch a nuclear weapon, it's all on. They're all going to go. You can't have a controlled nuclear war. Now, I've been at a conference recently where the American excuse for getting out of the INF Treaty, that it was the intermediate treaty with the intermediate nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union, is they wanted a treaty that included the Chinese. Now, today, the United States has agreed to maybe 1,200, 1,500 nuclear weapons on projectiles, on planes. In fact, the United States has on the shelf today 6,350 nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union has 6,750 nuclear weapons on the shelf, not including the tactical nuclear weapons. And the Chinese have 280 nuclear weapons on the shelf, enough for minimum deterrence. So I said to this guy, who's a new assistant secretary for nuclear weapons, I said, this story, you want to bring the Chinese in on the negotiation. I said, you don't know the Chinese. They're not going to sign a numerically inferior agreement the way the Japanese did in the Washington Naval Accords in the 1920s. They'll never sign that. They'll never sign that. They only have 280 of these damn things, and everybody else got thousands. They're never going to agree to that. And of course, he looked at me in the face and he said, everyone in the room kind of gasped because the emperor's not wearing any clothes here. People, the Trump people, got out of the INF treaty because they didn't like it. That's all. They just got out of it. Not because they wanted to bring the Chinese in, because the Chinese are never coming to that party. They're never going to show up for that because they're too smart for that. So anyway, in the Cold War, we use these nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War to defeat Japan, which looks defeated but is not defeated. And then they're used as kind of a tool to control the Soviet Union till 1949, but that doesn't work because now the Soviet Union has in 49 what we have. And they have the delivery system to get it there. These are one-way planes, sorties they call them. And then by the 1960s, everybody has nuclear weapons and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And the submarine-launched ballistic missiles are wondrous things because you can't track them. They're at sea. You can't track them. And therefore, they are survivable. If you're going to have a nuclear weapon and you want to play the game, you have to have a second strike capability. That is, you have to allow yourself, theoretically, to be hit, and then to hit the other guy with the doomsday equivalent. So the United States has a survivability, a deterrence. That's how deterrence works. Fear of reprisal, even if you take them out. And the former Soviet Union, Russia, has this. China, we're not so sure. North Korea doesn't have a survivable second strike. North Korea just is kind of a loose cannon. No one knows what they're going to do. The French have got a nuclear capability. The British have them on their Trident missiles, the Trident submarines. And so, and then we got Pakistan and India. I mean, India got one as a check against the Chinese, and the Pakistanis got a nuclear weapon as a check against the Indians. And so, I worry more about South Asia before I go to sleep at night than I worry about China, the United States, and Russia. I mean, Pakistan and India can produce catastrophic results. Today we have all these people in the international nuclear abolition business pretending they've told the world now that terrible things will happen if we use nuclear weapons, and they stand up and they get their Nobel Prize. But in fact, Carl Sagan did all this in the 1980s when he modeled, he's a physicist, an astrophysicist who modeled nuclear winter. Nuclear winter is enough to kill us off. So people today, they don't know who Carl Sagan is. These are a younger generation who they argued so successfully in getting rid of landmines, they were so good at it, that they turned their attention to getting rid of nuclear weapons and to sponsoring the prohibition of nuclear weapons in the United Nations. Of course, the 9 nuclear powers are never going to sign that because no one's going to give up their ace in the hole for a promise that the other guy is going to get rid of their stuff. And I always argue that these treaties are good as long as they buy us some time until we can figure out how to get out of this. Now, since the 1960s, the world of nuclear weapons, the people who study them, have formed 2 groups. And there are the optimists and the pessimists. Now, the optimists, nuclear optimists, are people like myself who believe that deterrence works. I think deterrence probably stopped us from having World War III, and that we still have time to do something about it. I think nuclear diplomacy works. It's hard, it's difficult, but until something comes along, I want to use nuclear deterrence. I want to use nuclear diplomacy until these weapons become obsolete. I'm waiting for the day that nuclear weapons are anachronisms, and they'll be replaced by some kind of energy source. Now, the other side, people who want to disagree with me, are called the the abolitionists. These are the nuclear abolitionists who want all nuclear weapons to disappear tomorrow. And they want everyone to feel ashamed of having nuclear weapons. And because they're expensive and they're terrible, and they're right about that. They are the second highest expenditure in American life. It's between the Manhattan Project and the end of the Cold War. Second highest expenditure according to Brookings Institution Atomic Audit, just behind Social Security. They're right. But no one's ever going to give up their nuclear weapons. But it does allow people a chance to jump up and down, feel very good about themselves. That isn't going to solve the problem. The problem is we need nuclear deterrence. Now, we've entered an age where we don't have a lot of rules, but we got a number of doctrines in place. The number of nations have said that they won't use nuclear weapons first. The United States has never said that. It said that it maintains an ambiguous policy. They want their enemy to know that they might use nuclear weapons first. And George W. Bush made this very clear with Saddam Hussein, that he said that we would use nuclear weapons if we thought someone else was ready to use their nuclear weapons. Mm. In fact, we would wipe out somebody who might have nuclear weapons. This is called preventive war. This is illegal as hell. Preemptive war is legal. If you know Genghis Khan is around the corner with a nuclear weapon, then you can take him out with a nuclear exchange. That's legal. But to take somebody out because they may pose a threat down the road, like Saddam Hussein did in 2003 or the North Koreans today, that's illegal. In fact, it's so illegal that the Chinese have told the American government, if you attack North Korea and they don't attack you, you're going to be at war with us. That's how clear that doctrine is. Now, the Russians have argued that they won't use nuclear weapons first, the Chinese, but I take you back to the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, where people outlawed war. All these nations signed up to never going to war. Well, that didn't work. And so the United States has this ambiguous policy. Now, what's interesting is with the modernization program, all the nuclear powers are modernizing them. They're making them smaller and quicker delivery systems, that they may see an opportunity to use these instead of the strategic weapons. That is, we're going back to the possibility of controlled, limited and controlled nuclear war or nuclear exchange. I don't know if that's going to work. In fact, Russia has indicated two interesting things. Number one, that it might use small nuclear weapons, that is, tactical nuclear weapons, to send a signal to the United States in the event of a conflict that it's ready to negotiate peace. And they use this phrase, escalate to de-escalate. That is, they might go up to tactical nuclear weapons to bring the conflict back down to zero. Now, I said to the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Weapons at a conference in Estonia, I said, this idea that the Russians are going to escalate to de-escalate, I said, it's about the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I said, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and no one throws the first punch, so he doesn't have to throw the second punch. When people are coming at you, it's not about to de-escalate, it's about to get worse. And this idea that anyone's buying this is a nonsense. Now, last week, in which timing for the show, which sort of got me going, was that President Putin of Russia has announced that Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in the event that they are about to lose a conventional war. He's not saying we need a nuclear exchange here to use nuclear weapons. He's saying that they would be used in lieu of being defeated. That is, Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in the event that they or their allies, and that's a new phrase, I hadn't heard that before, they or their allies are about to be defeated by superior conventional forces. So they're saying, well, if you're going to defeat us with plain old conventional forces, which are powerful, then we reserve to use the right of nuclear weapons. So what we got now is a whole new game of helter-skelter, where all the nuclear powers are not sure about what their doctrine is. We don't have the playbook. And I argued at a conference in December, we don't know what the red line is anymore. We don't know what anybody's red line is anymore. We don't have anybody studying these kinds of things. What is it the Soviets want? What are the conditions the Russians are setting before they use a nuclear weapon? We knew exactly what the Soviets were going to do and when they were going to do it. It's called declaratory policy. Even they knew that we were a little fuzzy about it in the West, about when we were going to use nuclear weapons. So we're not real sure when these things would be used. But I do know this, that as people put more money into the modernization of nuclear weapons, that is, smaller miniaturized weapons that can pack a punch, that we're into very dangerous territory because there are no rules anymore. We're back to setting the rules. And the Trump administration is barely in the mood to set the rules. And the Russians are not in the mood. And the Chinese are not in the mood at all to set the rules. So we got the three top nuclear powers who don't want to sit down and organize the new world order based on nuclear weapons. They reserve the right to use these weapons at a time of their own choosing. So we've gone from Eisenhower's massive retaliation to Kennedy's flexible response to the parody under Richard Nixon that is mutual assured destruction, to the world today, which doesn't have a name for its nuclear weapons. Well, we have our major arsenals, which have gone down. And the great fear after Barack Obama was that nuclear terrorism was a greater threat than thermonuclear war. And I argue that in recent years since Obama, we have the rise or the reemergence of great power competition, and the threat of thermonuclear war has gone up at about the same rate that thermonuclear terrorism was going up after Barack Obama. So I think the possibility of a nuclear war is as good as it's been in years and years, because we don't have a set of rules, and we got a whole lot of people who don't really play nice about this. Now, are there any questions, Simon?
Yes, absolutely, man. That's been an unbelievable history of nuclear weapons. I thought I knew something about nuclear weapons. I realized after listening to that I know absolutely nothing. And I think that what's so interesting to me is that you've just explained this massive history of the weapon. You're obviously incredibly knowledgeable about this. I don't know if you have notes in front of you or something, but you've written a book about it. People are calling upon you for expert advice.
I've written 10 books about nuclear weapons. No, I don't have any notes.
That's right. So what I'm trying to say is you are absolutely an expert on this subject. And to hear you say that you think that the chances of us getting into a nuclear war at the moment are actually heightened compared to what they have been, that's really interesting to me, because something that I often think about is, does the younger generation, as in myself included, do we think about these things? Like, who are the people in our generation who are taking up these positions as the writers of doctrine on, on nuclear weapons? Who are the people stepping into these positions and actually thinking about this? Because we all just take it for granted that we're not using nuclear weapons right now. But at the end of the day, somebody's got their finger on the trigger. And that's my question for you now is what's the process? Like, who makes the decision, the final decision, whether it is in China or Russia or America? I don't know if you know the difference of hierarchy in those countries, but who makes the ultimate decision? How many people have to turn the key?
Well, in most places, you need two human beings to turn their keys at about the same time to do a launch. Well, look, you raise a very interesting point. At this conference I was at in Germany, in Hamburg, in December, the German defense minister came along, and he told the German audience, as well as the visitors who were there, that Germany was going to invest money for the next 10 years into turning out strategic thinkers who thought about nuclear weapons. Because he says that Germany has no strategic thinkers today because they haven't been thinking about nuclear weapons. They've been thinking about other things, global climate change, poverty, globalization. People have been distracted doing other things while the nuclear weapons industry just keeps moving along. And he says there hasn't been a lot of thinkers. And I argued to this group, you know a lot about this and you know a lot about that, but we don't know people's red lines. We don't know the Chinese red line. We don't know the Russian red line. We don't know North Korea's red line. I mean, we used to, during the Soviet period, we used to get into the heads of Soviet thinkers and planners. It used to be called operational codes. we got into Marxist theory and what they thought about it and how they acted and the correlation of forces. And did be kind of a calibration about when to move and when not to move. Today, we don't know much about this, and we don't have a lot of people studying it. And here we go back to universities. Universities turn out very, very few people who understand these kinds of things. So they wind up being studied by think tanks and and various lobby groups in the United States. I'll tell you what, when I sit down with nuclear policy people in the United States and in Britain and other places, I never heard of these people. I mean, Jesus, they are a mystery to me where they're coming from, because at least with Kissinger had some interesting ideas on nuclear weapons. He wrote a little book in the 60s about it's okay to use nuclear weapons because you can control nuclear war. He's the first guy to come along and say, look, you can actually use these things. And if you can actually use these things, maybe we ought to think about how we not use these things. You know, there are great thinkers behind it. Today, you run across people who don't know anything about nuclear weapons, who are in charge of nuclear nonproliferation. And I'm thinking, my God, I mean, we've got a whole bunch of amateurs doing things. You know, they might be wearing stars on their shoulders, or they might have come from somebody's think tank, but they're not deep thinkers. You know, the original economists and mathematicians who looked at nuclear weapons, they thought hard and deep in all their lives about how these things work. These people today, you know, who's the top nuclear thinker? I mean, you got people in certain parts of the world teaching nuclear theories, and they've never written anything about nuclear history. They don't have any great books about it. They don't know anything. I mean, unless you understand Brody's original book in the 40s about the absolute weapon. He says these weapons are never designed to be used. They're used to intimidate the hell out of people. Yeah, I mean, the purpose of a nuclear weapon is political. Because once you start to use them, you set off a chain of events in which you disappear at the end of the day, which is not a very good idea, unless, of course, some philosopher was telling me from California that there are so many born-again Christians in Washington today that they don't care about using nuclear weapons because they don't care about end of days. It's okay if it comes sooner rather than later. You know, these guys are committed to end of days. They don't care if they roll the nuclear dice. I was thinking that might explain some of the spirited exchanges that you hear around the world about nuclear weapons. I mean, I think we can probably keep these things at bay until they become obsolete. You know, there was a time when the crossbow was banned by the Pope, except when you use it against infidels. You know, there's always been some weapon that's come along. Well, we pretty much agree to get rid of gas and chemical weapons and stuff like that. But nuclear weapons will change the temperature. They will bring on the black skies, the end of the harvest, and set up a chain reaction kind of thing. And look, we don't need Fukushima or too many Chernobyls to show us what happens when the radiation leaves in large numbers, when you leave it in the atmosphere. We actually get a little demonstration of this kind of thing. But we don't have a lot of great thinkers. Now, the few books that make the best-selling list are to show you that we should get down to nuclear zero. Ground zero is the catchword. Now, you got all these guys at the Hoover Institution, other places, all these former generals and secretaries of defense who say that we should get down to zero. These are all people who could have got down to zero when they're secretaries of defense and generals, but they didn't. You know, they join a club and they take a pledge. You know, this is after a lifetime of drinking. I'm not going to drink again. So, you know, after these people have left these high positions where they're in charge of nuclear doctrine, they now tell us we should get down to zero. Well, how do you do that? That is the $64,000 question. How do you go from this kind of nuclear thinking? And, you know, to use the old expression, the genie is out of the bottle. And we can play this game if you have enough young men and women invested in understanding how the game was played. But if you don't know any history, if you don't know what the ancients thought about the ultimate weapon or what to do with your enemy, I mean, these things, they go back thousands of years. Whatever the weapon is what do you want to do to people you defeat? I mean, do you wipe them off the face of the earth? Well, that's a possibility. You could do that. But what if you actually wipe them off the face of the earth, and their last message to you is they've wiped you off the face of the earth? I mean, the nuclear weapons always going to be a zero-sum game, or maybe you have to call a halt to it. And that's why there's a big debate about what's held off World War III. People, the nuclear abolitionists say it wasn't nuclear weapons. You know, in this country, our good friend Gareth Evans goes on about, nuclear weapons did not prevent World War III. It was just damn luck. Well, Gareth, that's not exactly what happened, okay? There was no World War III because there were nuclear weapons, okay? It works. It stabilizes. Now, look, we go down to the main question today is how do we prevent a thermonuclear war from taking place? Now, we're trying to prove a negative. Of course, it hasn't happened. But it's about, I think for your listener, it's about the spread of nuclear weapons. Is this a good idea or a bad idea? Some people argue the spread of nuclear weapons is poison. It just increases the chance for nuclear terrorism, increases the chances for nuclear war, the proliferation of nuclear. Now, I argue that the spread of nuclear weapons, and I'm using an argument that is well established in France in the 1960s, beginning with General Gaulois, who was in charge of these things, that the spread of nuclear weapons has actually stabilized the world in terms of the big bombs. It is a stabilizing effect, because if your big powers, your great powers, all have nuclear weapons, and they all know what's going to happen in the morning, they're going to disappear from the face of the earth, that forces them to think at another level. So the spread of nuclear weapons, is this a good idea or a bad idea? The nuclear abolitionists argue that it's a bad idea. I argue along with team deterrence, it's a pretty good idea until we got a better idea. And we don't have a better idea right now.
Yeah, it's certainly such an interesting kind of conundrum that we find ourselves in. And when you talk about getting to kind of like the ground zero, like the root issue of what this is, I kind of think it goes all the way back to the very first person who looked at another person and said, I don't like you and I wish you weren't here. It's like, okay, well, now you invent a weapon to get rid of that person. And, thousands and thousands of years later, we find ourselves at the position where, we have become so accustomed to saying, you know what, I don't particularly like you over there, that we have had to keep on creating more and more weapons. And, my brother is in the industry in America of defense. And, he's made it very clear to me that this whole military industrial complex is something that is both, it's terrifying, but it's also necessary. And this was a revelation to me. And it's something that you mentioned in your discussion earlier, which is that as soon as another country, which you think might be a little bit too trigger happy, gets their hands on a new piece of technology that could wipe out your people, you almost have to immediately start throwing money at it to get something similar to that or better, right?
That's exactly right. You have to build up to build down. That's exactly how it works. As soon as you perceive a threat, whether it's a missile gap or a bomb gap or something, you spend more money. So then when you go to the bargaining table, you can bring them down. And, it's the military-industrial complex is as Eisenhower said in his valedictory, it's not evil. It's just there. It works pretty well. Now, I think the great moral question was raised by, of all people, Ronald Reagan. Now, I didn't like Ronald Reagan very much, but he turned out to be the guy that ended the Cold War and ended the arms race. And he came at it with sort of a biblical conception of nuclear weapons. He argued, now he's offering the science community a third blank check, space defense system or Star Wars. He's saying, see if you can develop a way so these missiles never enter the Earth's atmosphere. In the space defense system, he's arguing that it is immoral to threaten nuclear war to prevent nuclear war, that it is untenable. It is humanly, spiritually, morally untenable to threaten utter destruction to prevent utter destruction. Now, the Catholic bishops wrote a newsletter that got under Caspar Weinberger's skin. He put it under Reagan's skin. And Reagan can see that. And when he's meeting in Reykjavik with Mikhail Gorbachev, And Gorbachev says, let's just take nuclear weapons off the table, the missiles. And of course, the generals on both sides nearly fell off their chairs. And Reagan said he wasn't going to get rid of the space defense system, the money he's thrown at it, the Star Wars system, because it was a way of making sure that nobody could ever be threatened by nuclear weapons again. And he said he'd be happy to share the fruits of the research when it was all done. And so getting rid of all missiles then, all nuclear weapons, foundered on that and Reagan's decision to keep SBI because he thought it was morally imperative that he find a way out of the conundrum. And the conundrum then is the one today. Can you use nuclear weapons to deter nuclear weapons? Can you threaten utter annihilation? You know, President Trump did it with fire and fury if North Korea used anything. I mean, what I like about Trump one way is he doesn't know any nuclear theory, so he can't get you in too much trouble. And when he had that little visit with Chairman Kim in Singapore, I know just what he said to him when they were alone. I know exactly what he said to him. He said to him, Simon, you can have your damn nuclear weapons, but don't point them at us. Don't point them at me. And that's exactly what's happened since that meeting in Singapore a couple of years ago. The North Koreans are no longer threatening the continental United States. And they're going to blow up North Korea or South Korea or Japan or whatever it is they're going to do. And of course, this is the other thing. While the United States and Russia dominate the conversation, and China to a certain extent, even though they don't have a lot of nuclear weapons, what are we going to be able to restrain or keep the club down to 9? It seems to me that if China unleashes on Taiwan and unleashes on Hong Kong and the South China Sea, and Americans are retreating, I don't think Trump's going to do much about these kinds of things. I think Japan will have a nuclear weapon on Monday morning. They're only, as they say in the business, a screwdriver away. Japanese can have one Monday morning. I've seen really intelligent people tell me that because the Americans can no longer be trusted in the future, Australia should have a tactical nuclear weapons on Monday morning to protect itself. Because Saddam Hussein is the poster boy. If you don't have a nuclear weapon, you're going to get run over like a tank. And Libya is the same thing. The guy got rid of his nuclear weapons and they got run over by a tank. And so a lot of other nations might decide to get nuclear weapons. They don't have to get strategic nuclear weapons, but they can get tactical nuclear weapons, the kind that they can deliver on an F-35 or something the enemy knows is coming. I mean, maybe this will be a boost to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But the idea of reducing nuclear weapons, I think we're in the other direction now. I think we're in a period where while we don't have as many nuclear weapons as we had at the height of the Cold War, we're going to have more delivery systems, more modernization and miniaturization in ways of delivering them. Now, I'll leave it to your listeners. If you are the commander of an aircraft carrier with 5,000 human beings on it, and you know that a little island in the South China Sea is going to launch a cruise missile at you, and you have a chance of sending a nuclear-tipped cruise missile to that island first, I know what they'd have to do. I mean, a commander is not going to risk 5,000 people and an aircraft carrier if he knows there's an imminent threat downrange. I mean, I think it's a no-brainer. I mean, people will turn to these nuclear weapons, and I heard a Chinese admiral say that after the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy, has sunk a few American aircraft carriers, America will butt its nose out. Nothing could be further from the truth. If somebody brings down an aircraft carrier, they're going to be visited by nuclear weapons in the morning. I think the threshold to use nuclear weapons is razor thin right now. It used to be pretty thick. Now it's gotten a little thinner. And even a president who doesn't want to use nuclear weapons may simply be overwhelmed by a fait accompli. That is, if someone attacks a major installation or kills a lot of Americans or America's allies, and of course, the question with America goes to bed at each night defending 37 nations around the world with extended nuclear deterrence. That is, they have a nuclear guarantee. Australia has a nuclear guarantee. Australia knows that no one can use, Australia cannot disappear without America showing up with a nuclear insurance policy. That is, to protect Australia in the last ditch effort. And so they got this extended guarantee. But what if the guarantee isn't worth anything? What is it? You know, what happens when the hurricane comes in and your insurance company says, oh, you're in the wrong place anyway. You're in a flood zone. Maybe they want a default on the insurance. So a lot of people now are getting a little nervous about whether America intends to defend its allies. That was de Gaulle's problem in the 60s when he developed nuclear weapons. He didn't believe America would exchange Chicago for Chicago for Paris. He didn't think they would ever give up their major cities to defend a major European city. Now, in my classes, I always talk about this story about trading Chicago for Paris. I always say, you know, you can have Cleveland or St. Louis, but I'm not going to get you Chicago. But the point is, at a certain point, your allies have to believe that you got their nuclear back. And if they don't, they're going to develop their own nuclear weapon. And you don't need a big scientific effort to get a nuclear weapon today. You can buy them off a shelf. You know, they're out there. You can get them from one of your partners or any place else. So that's a possibility. So we live in a nuclear world. I mean, I regard nuclear weapons and global climate change, and this COVID-19 is, you know, the pandemics is three of the great issues we have to face now in the 21st century. How do we deal with them? And do we have enough people who know how to deal with them? And let me tell you why the American economy was moving forward with Trump. First of all, they didn't give a damn what Trump had to say because he's, you know, it was a soap opera to the military-industrial complex. And the people who reflect them, the Dow Jones Industrial Averages, the reason the Dow reached unprecedented heights is because of the trillions of dollars the American government has put into the modernization of nuclear weapons. That is, new bombers, new missiles, new carriers, and new ways of delivering them, new ways of developing them. I mean, the military-industrial complex, which makes up about 80% of the Dow Jones Industrial Averages, here I'm talking about Northrop and Boeing and probably whoever your brothers work for, they're driving the industrial averages. They're getting all the money in the world to develop the next generation of nuclear weapons, ways of delivering them. And so they don't care what's going on in politics. It's just a television show to them. As far as they're concerned, the big money in America, the smart money, is going into modern weaponry, which is the next generation of nuclear weapons. And I reckon that sooner or later, they will be used. You know, I do believe that nuclear weapons have stabilized the world, but I also believe that sooner or later, we were going to blunder into using them, or there's going to be a mistake, or something's going to happen. And there's always a blunder or misconception or something like that, an accident. And we're going to get into this. And once they start flying, they're not going to stop. Because once you've launched a nuclear weapon, I don't care if it is a nuclear cruise missile, you will have begun a chain reaction that you cannot call back. You cannot stop. You know, it's what the Germans did in 1914 with the War of Annihilation, with the best army and one of the best armies in the world, is they just roll the dice. So one day, our leaders will just roll the dice because they see no way out. You know, at the end of the day, if they're right, they're going to have all the rewards in the world. And you know what, Simon? If they're wrong, and if we all perish, no one's going to complain.
Yeah. Man, it's such a complicated issue. I don't even know how to think about it. And I don't even know, because it's one of those topics that it's so interesting to try and understand it, but at the same time, it is so far out of my control. It is so far away from me that there's almost nothing to say. You know, it's there, it's happening. The people who are making it happen will make it happen. Like you argue, you know, we probably bypassed a couple of wars as a result of having it. What do you think that this is just so ingrained in human nature that we never get beyond nuclear weapons? Like, what do you think is the next step? Do you think there will come a day when we say, you know what, let's put them all down and let's try and maybe focus on just building our own countries up and making them stronger? Or do you think that there is another new technology on the horizon which is going to just make nuclear weapons look like child's play?
Well, the only way we're going to get out of the nuclear weapons business is if they're replaced by something else. That's what I mean by we'll get out of the nuclear arms race when they become anachronisms, when they become nothing but, flower pots in the desert or something like that. It's just when they're no longer useful. When they, the thing about nuclear weapons, and it's ironical, is they're useless. You spend all this money getting them and being able to deliver them, and you can't use them because the guy you want to use them again is going to destroy you 30 minutes later. So you find out the damn things are useless to a certain degree. I mean, they're always a political weapon, but they become anachronisms. Now, look, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I think it's easy to get your head around it. You think about all those young scientists who were studying particle physics in the 1920s, and they're trying to harness the sun. They're not trying to make a weapon. They're trying to master physics, solar energy, or the power of solar energy. And so you ask yourself, what are they doing? Well, they're trying to harness the sun for good reasons. And of course, every powerful source of energy has a downside. You can use a bow and arrow to hunt with. And you can also use it to kill somebody with in the 15th century. And the longbows came in, and my goodness, this was considered considered revolutionary, and the crossbows came in, they were considered revolutionary, and they were outlawed by the Pope, except against the Turks or the infidels and all the rest of it. And so, how do you buy security? Or what is security? What kind of level of security can you live with? Whether you are a city-state in Greece or you're a great empire in Persia once upon a time. I mean, what is the tipping point for your sense of security? I mean, what can you live with, and what can you not live with? And so these are these red lines I keep thinking about. Every society, whether it's 1914, 1939, 32, 33 in China, I mean, what's the red line? What gets people going, and what will deter them? Nuclear weapons have one purpose and one purpose only. Our nuclear deterrence is about the fear of nuclear reprisal. If you have a nuclear weapon and your enemy has a nuclear weapon, you better damn well think twice. Now, I keep saying to students in my 45-year career, I said, be very careful who you vote for because they can get you killed. Now, if you got a chief executive who doesn't know anything about nuclear weapons, so even Reagan, when he started, he asked, can you turn back a missile? Can you shut them off? Well, no, not really. But the point is, if you got people, you elect people who are unsophisticated about these things, particularly if they're not interested in what the scientists and their academics have to say. When COVID-19 passes us and all the other problems come back in full view, we're going to need people who've studied history and literature and languages to come together and try to decide, what is the definition of security? Is it just a slide rule that the scientists have, or is it something else? What can you live with? Now, I grew up at Ground Zero in Chicago. By the time Bertha Turtle showed up at my school, I was content growing up at Ground Zero. I was inured to it, immune in a sense. And at the same time, as I traveled across Europe as a young man and got to visit different places, they worried very much about a nuclear exchange because Europe always knew it was going to be in the middle of a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the event of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, Germany was going to disappear. I've seen declassified material, that is, it takes 30 years to declassify, but at one stage in the mid-1950s, the American Strategic Air Command had more nuclear weapons than targets. So sometimes it'd be 10 nuclear weapons, 10 thermonuclear bombs on one city. And I saw these targets. The papers are there. They're in the nuclear vault at George Washington University. You can just get them online. And you can see this paper, that if there was a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, the United States presumed that China was their partner. And they were going to take out all the major Chinese cities. And they presumed that the Warsaw Pact partners were America's enemies too. So they were going to take out Warsaw and Prague and Sofia, all the great capitals of ancient capitals of Eastern and Central Europe. And they're going to take out all these innocent people. They didn't do anything except be associated with the main member of the club, the Soviet Union. But when I think about in the late 50s, early 60s, we're going to take out every major city in China because we presume that the Chinese communists are hand in glove with the Soviet Union. And in fact, we did not realize for a while that they'd fallen out with each other. And so we're going to kill, all these citizens of China because we had a quarrel with the Soviet Union. I mean, you see what we're talking about here is that we didn't know who the enemy was. And if you don't know who the enemy is, where's the red line? At what point do you actually use these things? Now, a lot of the systems around in Israel and in North Korea, these are doomsday bombs that they have. These are things they'll use as a last resort. This is when they're going down the toilet. This is when they'll use these things. But nations that have real nuclear weapons capacity have deterrence, and they have a second strike. If you don't have a second strike capability, you got nothing. All you got is a nuclear weapon. And if you use them, you're dead. And who wants to do that? Except certain kinds of people on certain days. But the thing is that I think we can get our head around it. Is what is security? Or as George Kennan used to say, and I think he was quoting a former presidential candidate from South Dakota. He says, how many nuclear weapons are enough? And when we had about 50,000 nuclear weapons, how many are enough? How many delivery systems are enough? What does it take to deter the other guy? I don't know. I mean, if I were in North Korea or China or Russia today, I would think very hard and long about what it would be to provoke the United States. And if I were in charge of the French or the British nuclear or the Indian or Pakistani nuclear capability, I would think very hard about what it is I want to achieve. So hopefully we got a number of people in high places who think hard and long about these things, rather than ideologues who just take positions in various governments and administrations because they got some hardline views about when to use these things. And my fear is you're going to have a lot of people who know nothing about antiquity or ancient history or anybody's history who get into these places who have kind of a calculator about when to use a nuclear weapon. And I think there's some very dangerous people in high places. We just don't know their names because they're in charge of the bomb decision. And if the president gets taken out, the decision goes down the line. There are 24 people in line for the presidency. That is, the president, the vice president, the speaker, and all the way down to the 24th to 25th cabinet member. And there was a great book written in the 60s, a lot of these nuclear fiction books, where the leader of the Soviet Union is escaping by helicopter, and his attaché is a young lieutenant, and the Soviet premier is killed getting into the helicopter, and so someone says over the radio to the young attaché adjutant, well, should we launch or not? And the decision to launch is made by a 32-year-old guy who has absolutely no authority to do so. He says launch. Because, we may not find anybody with any moral authority to launch. And that's when the military this last week said to President Trump, if you give us a legal order and we don't like it, we'll resign. And if you give us an illegal order, we won't do it. And so if Trump or somebody said, let's launch a nuclear attack against somebody, they turn them down. I mean, the military has that kind of control. So, it's about civilian military complexity. It's about geopolitics. It's about, is anybody looking or listening? And let me tell you, when that atomic bomb came down on Hiroshima, John Hersey wrote a wonderful little book called Hiroshima, and he follows the lives of 5 or 6 people. And there's a housewife in Hiroshima who survived. And someone says to her, as he's interviewing people after the bomb, he says to her, well, did you expect this? And she said, if I have leaders who pursue policies that they pursue, then I can expect this to happen to me because I have no control over it. This is what you get when you have no control over war and peace. I mean, you get what you get. And the French have a wonderful explanation, Simon, or a wonderful idiom. It says most people get what they have coming. That is, if we allow people to make these decisions without proper information, then we have no one to blame except ourselves at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, it's quite intense. You know, I only have one more question for you, Joe. You know, you mentioned earlier Dr. Strangelove. I have to say to everybody who's listening to this, like, you have to go watch that movie. It's one of the funniest movies of all time. But my brother, he recommended that to me ages ago, and he said, you've got to watch this because it is so unbelievably accurate in many ways about the way that things are run in the military, right? And you know, it's obviously the story of this chaotic situation where somebody releases the nuclear bomb and basically mutually assured destruction happens at the hands of some absolute radical crazy person. And that's my question to you now. So have we ever come to a point in our history where we obviously have, what is the closest that we have ever come to actually pulling the trigger on mutually assured destruction? And what was it that stopped us?
Well, the closest we've ever come was probably the last day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the end of 13 days, President Kennedy made it very clear to Nikita Khrushchev that if there was a launch from a Cuban missile site, that the first America would hold the Soviet Union accountable, and that the Soviet Union would bear the brunt of a nuclear exchange if something took place in there. And Khrushchev wanted some face-saving gesture here. He wanted the Americans to say they weren't going to invade Cuba so they can get out with face. And the president that night received a conciliatory note. This is 13 days after the crisis started. He received a conciliatory note from Khrushchev that they would accept that. They would remove the missiles in exchange for America avowing not to invade Cuba. And then a couple hours later, they received another cable from Moscow, from the Kremlin, saying, we weren't going to do that anymore. Okay, it's going to be a war. And so when Kennedy went to bed, he didn't know how it was going to turn out, you know, because, and except his brother had a great idea. There's something called a trollop ploy. This is in one of these trollop books where somebody gives a false signal to somebody about what they want to do. In this case, it was a spinster who thought she'd gotten an offer of marriage. So what Bob Kennedy did was he ignored Khrushchev's second message, which was war, and accepted his first message and announced it on radio. And the Soviet president, the premier, Nikita Khrushchev, has agreed to defusing the situation. So what he did was he just gambled that by accepting the first offer and ignoring the second offer altogether, that he might get out of it. Now, we did not realize at the time that Khrushchev was under enormous pressure from his own hawks to do something, because they were ready to get engaged. But he didn't have the nuclear weapons necessary. You know, he could have moved very quickly in Eastern and Central Europe, which would have got a nuclear exchange going. But he didn't have his ducks in a row. You know, he needed more ships. He needed more men. He needed more tanks and that kind of thing. And Kennedy knew something that we know now, and that was nuclear weapons were the great equalizer. If the Soviets acquired more tanks in Eastern and Central Europe, or they acquired more men, or whatever it is, nuclear weapons would be the great equalizer. Today, Now that the United States has a preponderance of troops and material, the fear in American circles is that some other nation will use their nuclear weapons as the equalizer against American military strength. So they can be turned around and used on the Americans. But that was the great lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that we became we're really within a hair of a nuclear exchange, because once it would have started flying, that would have been it. The war would have been on. And we got very, very close. That night, no one knew how it was going to turn out. And, you'd like to think, we use the old phrase, calmer heads prevailed. Well, actually, we got a little bit lucky. Khrushchev was able to keep his opposition at bay, because you got to understand that the people who threaten you with nuclear weapons have their own domestic audience. That was always the case with Chairman Kim. If he gave Trump too much, his own military would put a bullet in the back of his head. If they didn't give him enough, Trump would put a bullet in the back of his head. I mean, this guy, he couldn't win coming or going. It was very interesting. But anyway, I think the closest we came was the Cuban Missile Crisis on the last night. We didn't know whether there was going to be exchange, and we got pretty lucky. Now, some people at Harvard, like Graham Ellis and others, wrote these big books on this classic case of diplomacy got us out of this crisis, and it was a brilliant ploy and all the rest of it. People like former Secretary of State Dean Acheson said it was just dumb luck we get out of it. It's just dumb luck that we stumbled through it. And I think the answer is somewhere probably in between those things. But I think that was as close as it comes. I was in my second year at college, at university, and I wasn't so sure there was going to be a war that night. I didn't do my homework. Of course, next day I had to do my homework. but that's as close as it got. Now, Able Archer in '83, that exercise there with the Soviets could have responded to a phantom attack on the radar system. That's considered very close. And, in those days, there was a Soviet leader named Andropov who was head of the secret police or head of the KGB at one stage, and he took America seriously. And when Ronald Reagan said the Soviet Union lies and cheats and is the evil empire, he reckoned that the Americans were getting ready for war. And so, and of course, when Reagan found out that they nearly went to war over something that was never a warlike act, he couldn't believe it, that the Soviets took American rhetoric so seriously. Well, rhetoric is important because it means things to a whole lot of people. But anyway, my winner for the closest we came was the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the war, both sides set up sort of fast communications systems with each other, and they also increased their military armor. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both countries spend as much money as they can on nuclear delivery systems and naval ships and the rest of it. It just, we got out of one thing, and at the same time, neither side wanted to be caught out or be caught short. But I think Khrushchev wasn't afraid. He fought in tougher wars than the Cold War. And but in the Soviet Union, and you're looking at that Politburo, and I'm just kidding, how many people make these decisions whether to use nuclear weapons? I'd say that in the great nations, the great powers, whether it's Chinese Communist Party in Russia, or China, or the Russians in Moscow and the Kremlin or in the White House, I think at the end of the day, the decision is made by about 10 people in a room about whether to go or not to go. Despite all the machinery there and all the cautionary work and all the planning, I think the ultimate decision comes down to about 10 people. And if they're all into groupthink, that is, they all want to sound like the leader, they'll all follow the leader. Now, in the past, what I liked about Barack Obama is he'd be given 5 options, and he'd turn them all down, say, no, thank you, I don't want to do any of these things. Would Donald Trump have the courage to turn down his military option? I don't know. Would Putin turn down his military option? I don't know. Would President Xi turn down his option? I don't know. And would Chairman Kim, would he turn down his military options to use nuclear weapons? He's still a work in progress. I mean, we haven't seen him except that kind of phony propaganda photo. I mean, he's not running around. But the North Koreans have probably 30 nuclear weapons. They don't need them to destroy South Korea. But what they can do is they can create a nuclear arms race in that part of the world, which would see South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan acquire nuclear weapons overnight. And then you have a complication, of course, because the Japanese are not afraid of the Chinese, the Taiwanese are not afraid of the Chinese, and so it goes. So you'd have multiple layers of questions to work out. But right now, I still think the spread of nuclear weapons has made the world a little safer place than it was. It may be repugnant to some people. It costs money that takes away. I mean, in 1893, a famous socialist, Edward Bernstein, said in 1893, he says there's kind of a Cold War going on. I don't know if the phrase was used, but we're spending all of our money on armament. He meant big battleships, the all gunships, the dreadnoughts. And he said they take away from the resources for people. So the more money you spend on armaments, the less you spend on people. Is that a good bargain? Probably not a good bargain at the end of the day, but people seem to have enough money for all the nuclear weapons that they want. It's a terribly interesting field. I produced 44 PhD students. 20 of them have gone into the nuclear field. And I might add that of my 44 students, about 70% of them are women. There's a lot of terrific thinking about what to do with these things, these doctrines. But there isn't much of that going on because universities have turned away from nuclear weapons and what they mean and all of the rest of it. I've done a little book called Nuclear Weapons for Oxford, which is their best-selling book, and then on the subject. And I've done a book called Real World Nuclear Deterrence, which sets aside all the political science theories and looks at how nuclear weapons really work and how they have worked historically. And then I did a 2-volume work with an old friend of mine, Dick Burns, who's in his 90s, on the global history of the nuclear arms race. And we looked at a nuclear arms race in terms of its politics and its impact on at least 10 or 12 societies that have acquired nuclear weapons, and find out if there are any truths that can be learned. And what we know at the end of the day is that nuclear weapons have been with us for 75 years, and we haven't used them since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Are we lucky or not? I don't know. I suppose that'll be up to people behind us. Thank you.
I love it. Thank you so much, Professor Siracusa. And look, I'm looking forward to our next conversation. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to sign up for email updates, join my Patreon meetup groups that we hold weekly, or if you'd like to offer feedback or suggestions for future guests or topics on the show, then you can head to simonjedrew.com. There you'll also find information about how we can work one-on-one together with my alignment coaching, based around the philosophical principles found in Stoicism. Finally, if you are on Facebook, then I'd love to see you in our group, the Practical Stoic Mastermind. But hey, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you next time.